Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about the very first chapter in the zoology called as reproduction in organisms. In this chapter, we will be concentrating on modes of reproduction, that is, two different types of modes called as asexual and sexual. So, after the completion of this chapter, we will be able to understand like how asexual reproduction takes place in organisms, and also you will be able to know the significance of it. Not only about the asexual reproduction, we will be knowing about sexual reproduction, its advantages, and its role in evolution. So let's talk something about the reproduction. So reproduction is one of the very important characteristics what we see in the living organisms. So when we try to define the reproduction, we say that it is a process where every living organism, in order to maintain its own species, tries to produce one more of its own type. So this process we call it as a reproduction. So now when we see that all these living organisms, they show a life cycle which involves birth, growth, development, maturation, reproduction, and the death. So that's what we say, that reproduction is one of the fundamental feature of all living organisms. So once it produces the young ones, that young ones grow, mature, and repeat the process. So thus reproduction results in continuation of species and introduces variations in organisms, which are essential for the adaptation and evolution of their own kind. So now, when we talk about the modes of reproduction, it has some basic features such as synthesis of RNA and proteins, replication of the DNA, cell division, and growth, formation of reproductive units, and their fertilization to form new individuals. So this is what it takes place whenever a new organism will be produced. So let's see now the major modes of reproduction. The number one, what we are going to talk about is asexual reproduction. So the word itself says that when you try to split the word asexual, say a and sexual. Means what? Without the sexual process, it can be able to produce a living organism. So we call it as asexual reproduction. And most of the organisms which undergoes asexual reproductions are mostly unicellular organisms. So let's see some of the examples. So you should note down this. It can be asked in the 2 mark questions like what are the organisms which undergo asexual reproductions. So it's given like bacteria, archaea, and multicellular organisms with relatively simple organizations we talk about. I said before that mostly asexual reproduction takes place in the unicellular organisms. But now in the examples we say that it also can be taken, it undergoes in multicellular organisms. But which type of multicellular organisms? We say that which is having relatively simple organizations. So the body organs are not that much complex. So in such organisms we see the asexual reproductions. So the second one, we say that it takes place with the help of uniparental inheritance, we call it as. Uniparental means what? To produce the young ones, only one parent is involved. So it says that whenever it reproduces asexually, the young one what it is produced, it will be very much similar to the parent. So we say without any genetic variation, Of course, variation takes place, but it will be very much. We use the word called as subtle. We use a word called as what? Subtle. Very, very minute variations can be seen in that. So these are the very important characteristics of asexual reproduction when we talk about. That is, it is seen in members of Protista, bacteria, archaea and multicellular organisms. Which type of multicellular organisms we say? That is with relatively simple organizations. And it should be, for asexual reproduction, it's not, two parents are not required. So we call it as a uniparental inheritance. So then we say that without any genetic variations, so we do not see a major variation in such living organisms. So now let's go by one, like what are the different forms of asexual reproduction. So number one, in the asexual reproduction, when we try to classify them, we call about fission. Means asexual reproduction takes place in the form of fission. It takes place in the form of sporulation, which helps in the formation of a small spores. It takes place in the form of budding, gemule formation, fragmentation and regeneration. So when we try to classify them in these different forms, very important is we need to remember all the examples in this. Okay, so now let's go one by one. So the number one when we talk about is fission. So fission. So something, the word fission is nothing but it has to break down into smaller parts. So we call it as a fission. Dividing itself. The organism tried to divide itself into a different parts. Maybe two, maybe many. So based on that, we talk about fission. Like number one, we talk about binary fission, we say that. So when we try to classify this fission, it may be of 4 different types. So number one, we talk about binary fission. Number two, we talk about multiple fission. Number three, we talk about sporulation. Number four, we talk about strobilation. In the sense what? That a single organism can be broken down into different parts. And each part of the divided parent will be formed into young ones. So please note it down, all the different types of the fission, because it will be asked. In a 2-mark question can be asked like what are the different type of fission. So we need to write like there are 4 different types of fission. Binary, multiple, sporulation and strobilation. So all these different type of fission will not be taken place in only one organism, but different organisms we can say. Okay, so now let's go with one by one. Number one, that is nucleus divides amitotically. When we study the characteristics of the binary fission, we should say that nucleus divides amitotically or mitotically. So now, when we talk about amitotic division, amitotic type of division. So far we have learned 2 different type of divisions. We say mitotic cell division and meiotic cell division. Now what is this amitotic? So amitotic type of cell division we see in certain very lower organisms. We talk about bacteria or we talk about certain organisms like what we call it as a paramecium. Okay, so now what is it amitotic? How it is different from the mitotic? So here in the amitotic cell division, the cell divides into two daughter cells, but it may not be the two daughter cells will be of equal size, and the number of chromosomes what it will be given to two daughter cells will not be equally divided. So it is one type of a very primitive type of cell division. So each daughter cells will be similar to the parent. So we call it as a type of division. Okay. So now here in the binary fission, the nucleus binary, when we talk about the binary, it says it is two type two. A single parent will be divided into two type of two organisms. So in all these asexual reproduction, first when it has to form two daughter cells, it should be divided into two different forms, like karyokinesis and cytokinesis. Karyokinesis and the cytokinesis. So in all this asexual reproduction, first karyokinesis. So what is this karyokinesis? First, when cell has to divide into two, the first step happens is the nucleus has to divide into two. So we say that it is karyokinesis. Karyon means nucleus. The nucleus is divided into two. So we call it as karyokinesis. So once the nucleus is divided into two, next the cell membrane, it invaginates itself inside and try to divide into two parts. So division of the cytoplasm, we call it as a cytokinesis. So all these, when we talk about a binary fission, a single organism try to divide itself into two offsprings. So the first process what it takes place is karyokinesis, and the next step is cytokinesis. So the resultant progeny or the offsprings are genetically identical to the parent. So why it should be genetically identical to the parent? Because the same parent itself tried to divide into two offsprings. So as a single parent is involved, there is no what we call it as variation has taken place. So it will be exactly identical to the parent. Very, that's what I always say, that variation do takes place, but it should be very slight, or we use the particular word called as subtle. So this is what we talk about the binary fission. So now it says that in all these asexual reproduction, first karyokinesis and the cytokinesis takes place. Resultant progeny are genetically identical to the parent. So try to write down all these points. The key points I have given you. So try to note it down. So now let's go with the next slide, which talk about types of binary fission. Types of the binary fission. The number one we talk about is simple irregular binary fission. The very sentence says that simple irregular. Irregular means it is not dividing at a particular shape or a size. It can be in any form. So only we call it as an irregular. Simple irregular binary fission. So the example we give here is amoeba. So whenever we come across the word amoeba, the most simplest figure what we can draw is about the amoeba. Why? Because it does not have a fixed shape. So you can draw however you want. So in this amoeba, the type of the binary fission, what it takes place is what? Simple irregular binary fission. And it should be noted that amoeba does not only undergo binary fission, it undergoes in different forms of asexual reproduction based upon the type of what do you call it as environment. If there is unfavorable environment, it tries to undergo in different form of asexual reproduction. But always, whenever we talk about simple irregular binary fission, the very straightaway example we can give is amoeba. So this is one. Next we talk about transverse binary fission. Here we are talking about different types of binary fissions. So binary fission is what? A single individual is divided into two forms. So number one, when we talk about simple irregular binary fission, example given here is what? Amoeba. Next we have something called as transverse binary fission. What do you mean by transverse binary fission? Here the parent will be divided in a particular plane. We say that the plane of the division runs along the transverse axis of the individual. So transverse axis of the individual, for examples, I keep on telling you that in this chapter we need to remember all the examples. Like which type of division will be taking place in which type of organisms. So when we talk about transverse binary fission, the example we give here is Paramecium and Planaria. We give it. So in these two organisms, the plane of the division runs along the transverse axis of the individual. We call it as transverse section when we talk about transverse section. Okay, when we try to divide it into, we talk about transversely. So here we say that in Paramecium, the macronucleus divides by amitosis and the micronucleus divides by mitosis. I already told you what is amitosis. It is a process of asexual reproduction where the two daughter cells will not be equal. The number of chromosomes will also not be equal. So this is a simple type of one division. Okay, so that is what we talk about the transverse binary fission. Now longitudinal binary fission. What is this longitudinal binary fission? Where the organism tried to divide itself in the longitudinal, lengthwise. So example here we give is Verticilla and the Euglena. So these are the two examples where the cytoplasm divides in the longitudinal axis of the organisms. If you see the down figure, I have given that longitudinal fission of the Euglena. Okay, so now this is Euglena. So here in flagellates are what? Those organisms which possess flagella. The flagellum is retained usually by one daughter cell. And the basal granule is divided into two, and the new basal granule forms a flagellum in the other daughter individual. So now when we see the Euglena, as it is dividing into two, the flagella also has to be divided into two. So the formation of the flagella in the Euglena takes place from that basal granule. So that basal granule tries to divide itself into two. So each basal granule, when the Euglena is about to divide longitudinally, the basal granule also divides and gives rise to two different types of flagella. We talk about that. So this is about we talk about the longitudinal binary fission, what we see in the Euglena. Below picture I have shown you about the binary fission which in transverse. Okay. So now there is one more example, a type of a binary fission we talk is oblique binary fission, which example is being quoted as dinoflagellates. And one of the example in the dinoflagellates we give is Serratium. So what do you mean by oblique binary fission? So so far where we have seen the above examples like irregular binary fission, transverse binary fission and longitudinal, means transverse in the sense when we try to cut the organism in the median wise, longitudinal lengthwise. Oblique binary fission, when we talk, it is not, I mean, we call something like neither partially nor at right angles to a specific originated level. We talk about that. That is a oblique binary fission. Example we give here is dinoflagellates and ceraceum. So these are the different forms of what? Binary fissions. So try to look it into the figures, and also you try to remember the examples specifically to this. So that's all for today's class. Further, we'll try to move with different forms of multiple fission. Try to get this is available in the PDF format. Please try to download it, and if possible, try to take a printout of that and try to go through this what till where I have taught now, and try to remember the figures with the types and their examples. Thank you. So today we have up to here. Next we'll start with the multiple fission.